The spotlight was hot, the crowd was electric, and Dean Martin was doing what he did best, making it all look effortless. But then something changed. His voice caught. Just for a second, his eyes locked onto something in the front row that made everyone else in the room disappear. There, gleaming under the stage lights, was a gun, not pointed, not drawn, just there, resting casually on a table in front of a man whose very presence could empty a room. Most performers would have frozen. Some would have run. Dean Martin, he did something so bold, so unexpected, that it would either cement his legend or end his life right there on that stage. He walked straight toward the armed mobster and offered him the microphone. Let me take you back to a different Las Vegas, one that existed long before the family vacations and corporate conferences. This was 1965, and the city was a glittering mirage built on a foundation of organized crime. Every casino, every showroom, every hotel, they all had invisible strings attached, and those strings were pulled by men who settled disputes with violence, not lawyers. The Sands Hotel was no exception. It was a jewel in the desert, partly financed by crime syndicates, and everyone who worked there understood the unspoken arrangement. You entertained, you made money, you looked the other way, and above all, you never ever challenged the men who really owned the place. The Rat Pack understood this reality better than anyone. Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, they were the kings of Las Vegas entertainment, but they knew their kingdom had landlords. Dangerous landlords. These weren't the kind of men you could charm with a song or a joke. These were enforcers, executioners, men for whom violence was just another business tool. And Dean Martin, despite his laid-back persona, knew exactly who they were. He'd grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, where the local barbershop his father worked in was a front for illegal gambling operations. Dean had been around tough guys his entire life. He understood their language, their rules, their capacity for brutality. But Dean had something else, something that set him apart from almost everyone in show business. He possessed an almost supernatural calm when he stepped onto a stage. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't bravado, it was genuine indifference to anyone's opinion of him. He was there to perform, to entertain himself as much as the audience, and if you didn't like it, that was entirely your problem. This attitude had carried him through decades in entertainment, but it had never been tested quite like it was about to be. The storm clouds started gathering 3 days before that infamous night. Dean was in his dressing room, relaxing before another sold-out show, when someone knocked on his door. His assistant, Jackie Romano, answered it and immediately went pale. Standing in the hallway was a man in a tailored suit, the kind of man whose very silence communicated threat. The message was simple. Mr. Antonelli wanted a private meeting with Dean Martin after that evening's performance. Dean barely looked up from his reading. His response was polite but firm. He was exhausted after shows these days. Perhaps another time would be better. The messenger's face remained expressionless as he delivered the next line. Mr. Antonelli wasn't making a request. He was insisting. Now, most people would have immediately agreed. Most people understood that when Vincent Antonelli wanted to speak with you, you cleared your schedule. But Dean Martin wasn't most people. He stood up, walked to the door, and looked the messenger directly in the eye. If Mr. Antonelli wanted a conversation, Dean explained calmly, he could come to the dressing room himself and ask properly. Dean Martin didn't take meetings with people who sent intermediaries. The messenger stared at him for a long, dangerous moment before nodding slowly and leaving. Jackie was trembling. Did Dean have any idea who he'd just dismissed? Vincent Antonelli wasn't just connected to organized crime. He was organized crime in Nevada. His reputation for extreme violence made even other criminals nervous. When Vincent wanted something, people gave it to him, period. Dean just shrugged and went back to his magazine. He worked for the Sands, not the mob, he explained. And last time he checked, his name was the one selling out shows, not Vincent Antonelli's. Jackie tried to make him understand the gravity of the situation. Antonelli had been linked to numerous murders. He was an enforcer, a problem solver, the kind of man who made people disappear. But Dean had dealt with intimidation his whole life. He'd learned early that showing fear was the fastest way to become someone's puppet, so he simply refused to show it. The next evening, after another packed performance, the messenger returned. Mr. Antonelli was downstairs, waiting to speak with him now. Dean was removing his bow tie, casual as ever. Tell Mr. Antonelli that Dean had already left for the evening. The messenger looked confused. Dean was standing right there. Exactly, Dean said with a slight smile. He could have sworn he'd left 10 minutes ago. The messenger's jaw clenched. Dean cut him off before he could continue. He'd just spent 2 hours working his tail off for the audience. He was tired. He was going to his room for a drink and then sleep. The messenger could stand there arguing, or he could deliver the message, his choice. Jackie was beside himself. Dean was going to get killed. He needed to talk to Frank Sinatra, who had relationships with these people and could smooth everything over. But Dean refused to involve Frank. He wasn't going to come running just because some tough guy snapped his fingers. He was Dean Martin. And Dean Martin didn't run for anyone. By the following day, June 17th, word was spreading through the sands like poison. Vincent Antonelli was furious. Casino employees who had connections to organized crime were quietly warning Dean's people that he needed to make peace immediately. Still, Dean refused. That evening, his manager, Herman Citron, practically begged him, just take the meeting, 5 minutes. What did Antonelli even want? Herman hesitated before explaining. Apparently, it involved the mobster's girlfriend, a dancer at the Tropicana, who'd been talking about leaving Las Vegas for Hollywood. Somehow, Vincent believed Dean had been encouraging her to go. Dean laughed out loud. He'd never even met the woman. He had no idea what Vincent was talking about. Herman was desperate. It didn't matter if it was true. Vincent believed it, and that's all that counted. Just apologize. Tell him whatever he wanted to hear, and this would all go away. But Dean was immovable. He wasn't apologizing for something he didn't do. If Vincent Antonelli had a problem, he could address it face to face like a man, not through messengers and intimidation tactics. June 18th, 1965. The day everything exploded. Dean arrived at the Sands around 6 in the evening for his 9 o'clock show. The entire hotel felt different. Staff members were whispering in corners. Security seemed hyper-alert. Something was coming, but nobody would say what. At 8:30, Jackie burst into the dressing room, his face drained of color. Dean needed to cancel the show immediately. Why would he do that? Vincent Antonelli had purchased the first 3 rows, not just for himself, but for about 20 of his associates. They were already out there, waiting. Dean didn't even look up from adjusting his bow tie. They'd bought tickets, hadn't they? That made them audience members like everyone else. Jackie's voice was shaking. This wasn't a joke. They weren't there to enjoy the entertainment. They were there to send a message. Dean turned from the mirror and smiled at his terrified assistant. Then he'd better make sure the show was worth watching. At 9 p.m. sharp, Dean Martin walked onto the Copa Room stage at the Sands. 2,800 people packed the venue, but the usual excitement felt different tonight. There was electricity in the air, but it was the kind that precedes a lightning strike. Dean scanned the crowd and immediately spotted them. 3 rows of men in dark suits, sitting perfectly still, and in the center of the front row, directly below the stage, sat Vincent Antonelli himself. He was massive, easily 250 pounds, with a face that looked like it had survived countless fights. His eyes were calculating, cold, and they were locked directly on Dean Martin. Dean smiled at the crowd. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Sands. They had a wonderful show planned, songs, jokes, and hopefully a memorable evening for all. He signaled the band and launched into Ain't That a Kick in the Head, moving across the stage with his trademark casual elegance. But his gaze kept returning to Vincent Antonelli. The mobster wasn't clapping, wasn't smiling, just watching. The first song ended to enthusiastic applause, except from those first 3 rows. They sat in complete silence. Dean thanked the audience, noting with dry humor that some folks in the front seemed a bit quiet. No offense taken, though. He understood it was hard to clap when your hands were occupied with other things. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. The men in the front rows didn't react. Antonelli's expression remained carved in stone. Dean moved into Memories Are Made of This. Halfway through the song, Vincent Antonelli reached inside his jacket. Dean's voice wavered for just an instant. But what emerged wasn't a weapon. It was a cigarette. Antonelli lit it with deliberate slowness, never breaking eye contact with Dean. Then he did something that made the entire room uncomfortable. Slowly, deliberately, he drew his finger across his throat, the universal symbol. The threat was unmistakable. Dean saw it. The band saw it. People at nearby tables saw it. A murmur of shock rippled through the audience. Dean stopped singing. The band continued for a few more bars before trailing into awkward silence. Dean stood at center stage, looking directly at Vincent Antonelli. The room was absolutely silent. 2,800 people collectively held their breath. And then Dean did something nobody could have predicted. He smiled. "Folks," he announced. They were going to deviate from the planned program. There was a gentleman up front who seemed to have something to express, and Dean was all about giving people a chance to express themselves. He started walking toward the front of the stage, the audience tense. Vincent Antonelli sat motionless, but his eyes narrowed dangerously. Dean reached the edge of the stage and looked down at the mobster. He'd noticed the gentleman making gestures all evening. Dean observed conversationally. He wasn't sure if it was an attempt at communication or perhaps sign language practice, but either way, it was becoming a bit distracting. The room was dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Dean continued. He had an idea. If the gentleman had something to say, why not come up on stage and say it properly? In fact, Dean knelt at the edge of the stage and extended the microphone toward Vincent Antonelli. Why not come up and sing? He seemed like he might have a decent voice. What did he say? Vincent Antonelli stared at Dean for what felt like an eternity. His face revealed nothing, but everyone who knew him understood this was the moment of decision. This was when Vincent Antonelli decided whether someone lived or died. The silence stretched impossibly long. The entire venue waited to see what would happen next, and then something remarkable occurred. Vincent Antonelli began to laugh. It wasn't warm or friendly, it was cold and calculating. But it was laughter. He looked at Dean Martin kneeling there, fearless with the microphone extended, and he laughed. "You've got balls, Martin," Antonelli said, his voice carrying through the silent room. "I'll give you that." Dean smiled. Was that a yes on the singing? Because he should warn him. The acoustics were quite good up there. His voice had better be ready. Antonelli shook his head, still wearing that cold smile. No, Dean should keep singing. That's what he was good at. Dean stood back up. Was he sure? The offer remained open any time. Antonelli confirmed he was sure. Then he added, almost casually, that Dean should keep doing his thing. He was all right. Dean nodded and walked back to center stage. He told the audience it looked like he'd have to finish the show himself after all, but before continuing, they should give his friend in the front row a round of applause, a tough critic, but a fair one. The audience, still uncertain what was happening, applauded nervously. Vincent Antonelli raised his glass in a mock salute. Dean launched back into his performance as if nothing had happened. For the next hour, he sang and joked with his usual charm. Vincent Antonelli and his men stayed for the entire show. When it ended, they stood and applauded along with everyone else. After the show, there was a knock on Dean's dressing room door. Jackie opened it to find Vincent Antonelli standing there, alone this time. Could he come in? Dean nodded. Sure. Would he like a drink? Antonelli entered and closed the door. Yeah, scotch, if he had it. Dean poured 2 glasses and handed one to the mobster. They stood in silence for a moment. Finally, Antonelli spoke. Did Dean know why he'd wanted to meet? Something about the dancer, Dean had heard. Antonelli nodded. His girlfriend had been talking about leaving Vegas for Hollywood to become an actress. He'd thought maybe Dean was encouraging her. Dean said plainly that he didn't even know who the woman was. Antonelli confirmed. He knew that now. Turned out she'd been talking about some other guy, a casting agent. He'd already taken care of it. Dean didn't ask what taken care of it meant. He didn't want to know. Antonelli took a sip of scotch. The thing was, he'd sent his man to talk to Dean 3 times. Dean had dismissed him every time. That made Antonelli look bad in front of his people. He couldn't have that. So he'd come to the show to do what? Scare him. Antonelli smiled. Something like that. But Dean hadn't scared, had he? Dean said he didn't scare easily. Antonelli agreed. He finished his drink and set down the glass. Here was the thing. He respected what Dean did tonight. Most guys would have lost control if he'd made that throat-cutting gesture, but Dean had walked right up and handed him a microphone. That took real courage. Or stupidity. Dean said with a slight smile. Maybe both. Antonelli extended his hand. They were good. Dean and him. Dean hadn't done anything wrong, and Antonelli respected a man who stood his ground. Dean shook his hand. He appreciated it. Antonelli headed for the door, then turned back. But next time he sent someone to talk to Dean, maybe don't make them come 3 times. Dean agreed. Deal. And just like that, it was over. What happened that night at the Sands spread through Las Vegas like wildfire. By morning, everyone in entertainment knew the story. Dean Martin had stood up to Vincent Antonelli, and not only survived, he'd earned the mobster's respect. The incident fundamentally changed how organized crime viewed entertainers in Las Vegas. Before that night, performers were considered expendable employees. Dean had demonstrated that a performer with sufficient courage and charisma could command respect, even from the city's most dangerous men. Frank Sinatra called the next day. Was Dean out of his mind? Did he understand what Antonelli could have done? Dean responded calmly that Antonelli could have done many things, but he didn't. Frank wanted to know why Dean hadn't just taken the meeting when first asked. Dean thought for a moment. Because if he'd come running the first time Vincent snapped his fingers, he would have been running for the rest of his life. These guys respected strength. Frank knew that. Show weakness, and they owned you. So Dean hadn't shown weakness. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed. Dean was either the bravest or the dumbest person he knew. He couldn't decide which, maybe both. Dean said, echoing his words to Antonelli. Over the years, the story grew into legend. Different versions emerged. Some claimed Dean had pulled out his own gun. Others said Antonelli had actually come on stage to fight him. None were true, but they spoke to how the incident had captured imaginations. The real story was simpler, but perhaps more impressive. Dean Martin had faced down a killer with nothing but charisma and courage. He'd refused intimidation and secured his place as a true Las Vegas legend. Vincent Antonelli and Dean Martin maintained respectful distance after that night. They'd occasionally see each other at restaurants or casinos and exchange acknowledgement. Antonelli even attended a few more of Dean's shows over the years, always in the front row, always applauding enthusiastically. In 1973, Vincent Antonelli was killed outside a Las Vegas restaurant, a mob hit resulting from internal power struggles Dean knew nothing about and wanted to know nothing about. When he heard the news, Dean was quoted saying Vincent was a tough guy, but a fair guy. In his own way, he'd been a man of honor. Years later, when asked about that night in June 1965, Dean always downplayed it. People made too much of it. He'd say he just didn't want some guy in the front row ruining his show, so he addressed it, that's all. But those who were there knew better. They'd witnessed something rare. A moment when courage and composure in the face of genuine danger transformed a potentially deadly situation into mutual respect between two men from completely different worlds. Dean Martin built his entire career on appearing cool and unflappable, but that night at the Sands, it wasn't an act. He really was that cool. He really was that unflappable. And he really was that brave. The microphone he offered Vincent Antonelli became a symbol of something larger. Dean's way of saying, "You want to be in charge? Fine, take over. But until you do, I'm running this show." And Vincent Antonelli, one of the most dangerous men in Las Vegas, had recognized that courage and respected it. That's the real story of the night a mafia boss threatened Dean Martin on stage. No gunfight, no dramatic escape. Just one man refusing to be intimidated and another man respecting him for it. In the end, that's what made Dean Martin a legend. Not just his talent or charisma, but his absolute refusal to bow to anyone, no matter how powerful or dangerous they were. Dean Martin was the king of cool, and on June 18, 1965, he proved exactly why.